Secrets of the Ferns, Chapter 1, Mrs. Rutledge by Jackie DeVille. A quiet neighborhood called East Union was home to many citizens, and it was 1926. Electrification had begun for many towns like East Union. It stood not too far from Shantyville, which had the shops and theaters and restaurants. The manor stood at the end of a cul-de-sac. Wrapped around its property was a certain permanence, with a black iron fence which had lovely brick pillars on each side of a very secure gate. The fence had been overgrown by vines through the years. These clambering vines had thorns and bright red flowers that nobody in East Union had ever seen before. Four acute triangles made their petals of a shiny bright red, almost too red, like blood, with yellow pistils and filaments which coiled like copper dynamos. The kind folks around this part of East Union would joke about how these flowers at Rutledge Manor were carnivorous, consuming small rodents and birds that disturbed them. It kept the children from picking them when the thorns weren't daunting enough. The locals called the flowers bloody devils. They secreted a sticky sap that was hard to wash off, even with the strongest of diluted lye.
I heard she killed her husband around the turn of the century. That's why she's so rich.
One kid would say to the other at the end of the cul-de-sac. The other kid, leaning against his bike, might say,
Well, I heard she is a vampire. She is a man who comes every Saturday night. I think he brings her addresses of her victims.
The two kids would joke about vampires and murder mysteries and eventually decide to continue down the road on their bikes. The whole property was old, probably having been built before the Civil War and possibly before that. Some conjecture led people to think it was built around the lifetime of Nathaniel Hawthorne, or even the witch trials. Many tales were told about Rutledge Manor. Many oaths were sworn to never poke the bear that was the mystery that hid behind its gates. The neighbors were obscured by large hedges of their own, perhaps as some way to shut out its scenery, despite how remarkably beautiful the house was, with its Gothic architecture and alluring sense of welcome. People saw Mrs. Rutledge leave the house around 9 o'clock each night for her evening strolls in the moonlight. They saw her leave around 8:30 in the morning for her early strolls in the fresh air.
Why, hello, Mrs. Rutledge,
her neighbor once greeted her. She was a young, beautiful woman in her 30s, married to a man who worked at the patent office. Mrs. Rutledge would tip her hat at her and smile with a little wave. She was deemed eccentric, but the immediate neighbors seemed to forget all the ominous mysteries and folklore surrounding her and her property. Strange, colorless lights and droning, humming sounds could be seen and heard really late at night, but these were seen by those seldom individuals who, with nocturnal tendencies, were easily dismissed as opium addicts or slaves to the whiskey bottle. Nobody really suspected Mrs. Rutledge of anything out of the ordinary. That sweet old lady in her 70s who was widowed 20 years prior, who always smiled and kept to herself. It was 10 o'clock, one chilly March night, when Mrs. Rutledge was returning home from her stroll. The street was very quiet except for the neighbor, Ted Parkinson, who had just bought a new radio he had blasting in his modest dining room window. It could be heard near the entrance of the cul-de-sac, but as Mrs. Rutledge made her way to the large house at the dead center end of the loop, the sound of jazz and minstrel music faded away. Mrs. Rutledge checked all the driveways and windows for signs of people. When it was for sure that nobody would see her do it, she pulled out her book of cigarettes and began to smoke one. She saw Ted Parkinson shut his lights off and step outside on his porch to brood over a cigarette of his own. His bench faced away from her. A lonely man, a nice evening, a quiet block. Ted remembered some wonderful music he had heard that night. Sounds of yodeling clarinets and lightning-fast accordion players passed through his mind between long pauses of silence, hearing nothing but the leaves of trees and hedges blowing in the wind. The sky up above was cloudy, demonstrating hues of blue and purple. She could sense a coming storm. A stillness in the wind placed goosebumps on her skin. The air felt so fresh and smelled wonderful, but Mrs. Rutledge dreaded such weather, so she quickly locked up her gate and made her way inside after finishing her cigarette. As the street lights faded, the vining flower blossoms closed up quickly one by one. An orange tabby howled just at the end of her property. A few crows hastened into her trees. She fastened the locks to her house and decided to go downstairs, where she spent a great deal of her time. There was a large basement with a huge wooden table that lined down one wall. It was covered in objects that no man had ever seen before. A large metal box with dials and levers and bulbs was surrounded by wires she had hooked to a generator she paid a hefty price for. The kit to build it was commissioned to a man who was once an apprentice of Thomas Edison, who helped him and many others develop fantastic inventions that helped theaters add audio to their moving picture shows, that lit up East Union brighter than it had ever been lit up at night. She took 5 years putting it together herself and attaching the wires and nodes to their appropriate spots for all her strange machines. She had some oval disc that curved and stuck out a small semi-basement window. There were cabinets full of small electronic specimens, copper wire, little metal plates, small screws, rubber, springs, and magnets of all sizes. She had a large tank filled with an oddly pleasant-smelling liquid. It was brown and almost too cold. On the opposite wall grew 24 ferns. They were plants that were large in size, a perfect cover to hide suspicious things. These large fern plants took up half of the entire basement, and she had many free-roaming garden spiders down there. It was an unnaturally warm basement, warmer than the rest of the house, for behind the walls were steel walls, and inside of them large heating coils which warmed the room very efficiently. It was humid, but Mrs. Rutledge had somehow been handy enough to seal all of her electronic parts and equipment with a greasy sealant. She had buckets of the stuff stacked in the corner. Among her strange gadgets was a small speaker that nobody had ever laid eyes on, that she made herself, of course. It had a wire to another box, and she would adjust the levers and dials on the larger box while the device was placed into her ear. Green and red lights flashed in rhythm as she adjusted it to her liking, listening carefully, listening for...
"Station 879, please come in,"
said Mrs. Rutledge. Her voice was changing slightly over the course of a few seconds as she spoke. Subtle distortions were heard from the back of her throat, making unworldly sounds to the careful ear, and from a distance could be disregarded as mumbling sleep talk.
"Station 879, please come in. My current report is ready."
She spoke again as her blue eyes blinked, and in that flash turned black. Her smile anticipated this report she had to give. Finally, she got an answer that she alone could hear in her small device that she had lodged in her ear.
Yes, the subject was last seen in Magdalen College, Oxford. Yes, transpsychokinesis. It was gathered from a young woman who interacted with my thought thief. Yes, the shifter of information has gotten well calibrated to the equipment. She had just gotten back from vacationing in England. She gave our thief her brother's thoughts, who attends classes at the university. Yes, the subject is now a professor. His main interests have diverted radically in the last 2 lifetimes. Yes, I can safely assume he is no longer a threat, but I will continue with my mission, which has 7 weeks remaining. My next communication will be in May.
She clicked off the machine, took out her ear device, and shut down the generator. Mrs. Rutledge made her way upstairs to a lounge where she smoked a cigarette and stared out a window, enjoying a cold sweet tea. In what counted as her heart, she sat drinking tea. She felt a burden of longing for home which was far away, longing deep for her mission to be over. She wished she could hug her mother and frequent the places of her childhood. She looked up at that clouded sky, wishing she could see glimpses of stars or a moon, something that could remind her that outside those clouds and that high atmosphere lay the path to home.